Welcome everybody. Final breakout sessions for the day. Welcome. Thank you for being here. This breakout session is titled "Tracing the Public Health Consequences of the Police Murder of George Floyd." Some housekeeping items, really quick. If you have any questions for our presenters, use the Q&A function here on Zoom. Also, if you have technical difficulties, I'm going to be putting the email and the phone number in the chat. And well, I would now like to turn it over to your presenters for today. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this breakout session. My name is Ryan Larson. I'm a professor of criminology at Hamline University. And I'm excited to share with you some ongoing and proposed research our research team has where we trace the public health consequences of the police murder of George Floyd. Before we get started, I want to turn it over to Chris Robertson, another part of the research team, to introduce himself, and then to Kamisha Johnson.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Robertson. I am a PhD student at in sociology at the University of Minnesota. I'm excited to be here, and as Ryan said, to talk to you all about the public health consequences of George Floyd's murder. And I'll turn it over to Kamisha Johnson.
Peace and healing, everyone. I'm Kamisha Johnson. I am the owner of Amani Healing Services. I am a therapist clinician by education, but the calling on my life, I am a healing enthusiast, aka hood healer. I do a lot of community work. I curate safe and sacred spaces for people to heal our way, especially marginalized communities. When after the unfortunate lynching of Brother George Floyd, I closed my private practice and I went complete mobile into the community and showing up and holding space for the community to heal. We had all experienced some collective trauma. We have trauma in our DNA, a lot of us from marginalized communities. And so my education tells me to be very trauma driven, but in this season of my life, I'm very healing driven. So I am here to discuss what I brought to community after what happened to Brother George Floyd. And I am excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamisha. Just to let everyone know, part of this process is not only for us to relay the research and the work, some of the racial healing work that is being done in Minneapolis, but also to get your thoughts and feedback on the work, where we could take it in the future, questions you may have about it. So please feel free to use the Q&A button as we go, and hopefully at the end we'll have some time so we can answer some of those as we move through. So just to give a little background and introduction to the kind of the research side here. We as a research team, and what I mean by we is Chris Robertson and I, alongside an epidemiologist from the University of Washington, Jeannie Santalaria, as well as Christopher Eugen at the University of Minnesota. We became really interested in the kind of consequences or the after effects after the highly publicized police murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2005. There was a lot of talk locally about increases in crime and gun violence, particularly homicide, whether that was pandemic related or whether that was related to the social unrest that was triggered by the murder of Mr. Floyd. And so we really wanted to kind of situate ourselves in kind of disentangling some of these ideas, right, and using local administrative data to do so. This led us really to consider, this, the effects of this, not just in terms of crime, but also in terms of health, right? When we see an increase, say, perhaps in firearm assaults, right? That's not only an increase in, say, criminal offending, but also in terms of a health outcome, right? In terms of assaults, injuries, et cetera. So this really led us to consider, what does the timing look like? If there are increases, when did they happen? Did they happen when the pandemic started? Did they happen after the unrest? What is the kind of temporal aspect of these increases in health outcomes look like, right? And then secondarily, what perhaps explains these increases, right? Is a kind of central question guiding us. And then also, what else has an event of this magnitude impacted, right? We think more broadly about health, right? So we started kind of in this narrow, like, hey, let's try to put a little bit of context to what the Star Tribune is reporting in terms of firearm assault injuries, but also to think more broadly about the broader public health impacts, right? To think beyond just the individual victimization that takes place in police violence, but think more broadly about how that can impact the health of entire communities. So this led us to a few research questions here. What has kind of been the public health impact of this police murder, this particular event, right? There's a lot of research that looks at, generalized police violence that we'll discuss here today. But we wanted to look specifically at this one high-profile incident and look at a really localized effect, right? Our two key outcome variables we have worked to study so far have been firearm assault injury incidents, as well as mental health diagnoses across Minneapolis, right? We also ask how these processes might be differentially based on race and space, right? Are the effects of the police murder disproportionately felt in certain communities than others? And we'll talk through that as we go through. And secondarily, this has led us to some new proposed research, thinking about how police violence generally, beyond just one singular incident, perhaps, impacts public health, right? Secondarily, we want to look at also the causes of police violence, right? And we want to go past simplistic notions of crime or of kind of public safety, but rather thinking about historical legacies of structural racism. And Chris Robertson has been key in bringing that into our team here as part of his dissertation as well. And I'm sure he'll speak more to that as we move forward. So I kind of want to give kind of a roadmap of where we're going to go here. Kind of the part one is going to be talking about the research our team has already completed. So this is in terms of the firearm assault injury, which was published just this year, as well as mental health hospital incidents, in terms of mental health diagnoses. And this is now, I'm happy to report, no longer under review when I crafted these slides, but is accepted for publication at the American Journal of Epidemiology. The second part is where we'll get into some of the proposed research moving forward, right? Thinking about the complex relationships between historical structural racism in terms of redlining or racial covenants in Minneapolis and St. Paul, its relationships to contemporary, perhaps, police shootings, and health, and really thinking about how that relationship how historical legacies might impact current day contemporary realities in terms of police violence and its impact on health. Part three, we're going to bring in Kamisha Johnson here, really to think about strategies of resilience and racial healing in Minneapolis. This is a big part of our proposed research as well, in thinking about our qualitative design of our research, thinking about our interviews with individuals, what strategies are they using for resilience, for racial healing, what kind of work is being done like that in Minneapolis. And then part four, hopefully we'll have some time to read off some questions and then give you some answers as best as we are able. All right, let's take a look first again at the work completed. So why would we expect an uptick in gun injury after the murder, right? Let's think about a few different explanations. One that's been proposed is the pandemic explanation. And this is where there's been an increased visibility of existing vulnerabilities, right? So Professor Wrigley Field's research from the University of Minnesota shows that COVID-19 disproportionately impacted non-white communities in Minnesota. And there's also been perhaps a weakening of social bonds, less people going to work, less people going to school, right? That there's been a weakening of social networks. And social bonds have been key in terms of explaining differences in crime historically. And the second big explanation has been, it's got a lot of traction locally, and is the depolicing explanation. And previous research is pretty mixed on this topic, but the idea is that after the police murder, the police kind of withdrew and didn't make as many stops, didn't use as many uses of force, or stopped essentially active policing. And the idea from a deterrence theorist would be that, hey, this might have impacted, and there wasn't police out there to deter the crime, right? So it increased. And we directly test this hypothesis in our work, and we'll get there to our kind of conclusions on that locally. And finally, the police murder likely really augmented legal estrangement, right? Legal estrangement is the idea of like feelings of distrust in legal institutions, but also combined with kind of the structural social exclusion, right, of certain communities, and how those things can intertwine. And the police murder may have exacerbated already existing tensions between police and community, and therefore may have had people not trust the police, right, not call them when they're in need and take matters into their own hands, perhaps. And, so we kind of assess some of these ideas in our own work. Let's think about mental health as well, our kind of second dependent variable or outcome variable. Why would we expect this event to impact mental health? And it's quite obvious, really, but let's ground ourselves into the previous literature just a bit, right? That a large body of research shows that there's adverse mental health impacts of exposure to police violence. So that's not only that direct victimization, there's also that as well, but also just exposure to it, being near it, seeing it, in terms of general anxiety, depression, suicide attempts, and also the anticipation of future police violence. Seeing police violence can make one more wary about being around police in the future. And these general health effects extend beyond just this direct exposure as well. Just being in close spatial proximity to events of police violence can have detrimental health impacts. Some research shows that exposure to a police killing is associated with 0.14 additional poor mental health days per month for Black individuals. So this work, and they did not find a comparable increase for white individuals. So there's some evidence that these effects are also racialized in ways. And we also engage that in our work as well. So research questions. Did firearm assault injuries increase after the police murder of George Floyd? If so, was there spatial variation in this increase? In other words, did it happen equally everywhere, or did it increase in certain areas more than others, right? And if so, right, does pandemic policy, right, or changes in policing explain this increase, right? So we directly test some pandemic-related explanations as well as the depolicing explanation we test pretty rigorously. And our second big research question is, did mental health diagnoses increase after the police murder of George Floyd? And based on previous research, if there was an increase, right, amongst which racial groups did this occur? And if so, was there also spatial variation in this increase by race even, right? Or was it experienced kind of homogenously across Minneapolis? Or were there certain areas in which this was experienced more heavily, so to speak? So just to give an idea of some of the data we are using to investigate these questions, I'm going to kind of gloss over this a little bit, but just to think a little bit about some of the data we're using. Our focal outcome variables come from hospital administrative data from the Minnesota Hospital Association data. See, we have firearm assault injury rate and the mental health diagnoses, respectively. So normed for population. So we see how these over time have changed. I'll talk a little bit more about our design as we get there. Our focal predictor variables are going to be kind of time, right? How do these things change over time, pre and post the event, et cetera. We also have many time varying controls. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A if folks have questions about our controls and where these measures come from. But the key ones I want to point individuals to are the MPD data use of force, stops, and officer-involved shootings. These are our kind of focal measures of policing behavior in Minneapolis. And so they are our kind of key controls in terms of assessing the depolicing explanation. Now, we're going to get a little technical here. There's a formula here. I know it can be a little scary, but I want to talk a little bit about our data design. Our data design is kind of a quasi-experimental design where we look pre and post an event. And this is called an interrupted time series design. The idea here is we have a policy intervention, right? And we have here just an intervention group. So we don't have a control group here, like another county that didn't experience the police murder of George Floyd, right? That's a tough thing to empirically find, right? Because this was a very national, international event, a treatment, so to speak, right? So what we have is the green line, for example, right? And so what we do is we look at gun assault injuries or mental health diagnoses over time. And we look what happens pre and post. So our key focal parameter here is this event parameter here. And then we also have, we have the time trend before and what the time trend looks like after. So in this case, this is a pretty strong treatment. It decreased whatever the outcome is, and then also changed the direction of the relationship as well. So these are kind of the statistical models, the designs we use. Because we're comparing Minneapolis to Minneapolis, this is a pretty strong design, right? A lot of the, in observational research, there's large threats to validity if we can't rule out alternative explanations, meaning other things that could have explained the jump, right? But because we're comparing Minneapolis to Minneapolis, right? Things that are constant over time, like a generalized anxiety or or level of the economy at the time, right? Those things are kind of constant relative between Minneapolis before and Minneapolis after, right? So threats to our design are really things that happened in the week of the police murder of George Floyd, right? So we want to control for other things that changed contemporaneously in that week, which are really things like policing, perhaps, right? So we have those kind of key controls. Let's get into some findings. That's kind of the interesting stuff. Here's a time series plot looking at weekly firearm assault injuries using the hospital data from 2016 through 2020. If we notice, like the key thing that sticks out here is the timing of this increase, right? We notice that the timing of firearm assault injuries doesn't spike at the beginning of the pandemic, right? It spikes in the week of the police murder of George Floyd and in the coming weeks afterwards, and then starts to decrease to pre-treatment levels. So we see some actually pretty strong evidence here that likely that the pandemic isn't going to be a key explanation here, right? In terms of, oh, it was just the pandemic, it's not the police murder. We also can see how this increase is varied by space, right? So these maps depict Minneapolis ZCTAs, zip code tabulation areas. These are essentially kind of like mailing zip codes, but are the census designated spaces. They don't exactly overlap with mailing addresses because the Postal Service changes addresses faster than the census does in terms of zip codes, but they're roughly comparable. So what we do is we spatially locate individuals on the basis of where they live, not where the injury happened, but where they reside or where they're experiencing kind of that injury. So we see in the pre-killing period, we see a little bit of spatial variation in terms of firearm assault injury rates, right? Slightly elevated in North Minneapolis, as well as kind of in the East Phillips neighborhood, as well as downtown. And we see in the 3 months, 0 to 3 months post-killing, we can see that there was, we can see that same increase that we see in the time series plot. But we also see that the increase wasn't experienced equally everywhere. We can see spaces down near kind of like the lakes area, so to speak, of Minneapolis, like are blue in both and across all three, right? The firearm assault injuries didn't really change in those spaces, right? So this is really speaking to who is getting injured here by the health consequences of this event, right? And we also put more rigorous tests to this than just a pure descriptive approach. We have some interrupted time series models here. A lot going on this table that I'm happy to answer more about in the Q&A if folks want. But the key thing to look at here is this post-killing coefficient, which is the fourth one down on the left, right? And if we look across space here, across Minneapolis, we see a 1.78 increase in firearm assault injuries per 100,000 after the police murder. That's pretty substantial increase. And key here is, hey, say we have a model and we include the MPD indicators, right? AKA, if we include the indicators, does that explain away some of the increase, right? If policing, right, depolicing, if that explains some of the increase, that our increase coefficient should get smaller, right, when we introduce those measures. But the model where we introduce those measures, we can see it's about 1.77. Really, there's no statistically significant difference between these two coefficients, 1.78, 1.77. And that indicates to us that depolicing, to the extent that MPD did kind of perhaps, like we can see stops go down, right? We can see that in the data. That doesn't really explain a lot of the increase. So that tells us that, hey, this is due to something else other than the increase. We also have what's called an interaction term. And what that term does is it says, hey, okay, there's an increase, but where was that increase highest, right? And so we have our, we have predicted gun assault rates per 100,000 here, firearm assault injury rates. And then we have varying the percent Black of the neighborhood. And injuries increased much higher, right, in spaces that were more concentrated with Black residents. So this kind of confirms kind of the descriptive evidence we see in the maps. So I'll come back to some conclusions from this in a bit, but let's talk about then our second dependent variable here, the mental health diagnoses. Here we look at mental health diagnoses over time. There's not as big of a quote unquote treatment effect here, right? If we look pre and post the police murder, right, we can see that it does increase a bit, right? But not really, it doesn't have that kind of huge spike that we see in the gun assault injuries, right? So a little bit more muted of an effect, but we're going to explore perhaps some ways in which the effect is bigger for some groups rather than others, right? If we look and we make each of these lines a subgroup based on the racial identification of hospital patients, right? We can see a much larger increase amongst Black residents in Minneapolis as compared to Latinx or white residents. When we put this into an interrupted time series model, right, when we model these lines over time, right, again, controlling for changes in policing, right, because everyday policing could impact mental health diagnoses as well, controlling for weather, right, seasonality, right, mental health can change with the seasons. We find that in terms of a post-killing effect is much larger for Black residents in Minneapolis than either white or Latinx. We see an overall increase that's not statistically significant, about 0.152, right? But when we split it out by racial subgroups, we see a 0.228 mental health diagnoses per 1,000 increase as compared to a 0.061 and a 0.022 for Latinx, or for white and Latinx residents respectfully. So we see a much larger impact of the police murder on Black residents as compared to residents of other racial identifications. So our last question here was really about the spatial variations in effect, right? As you saw in the firearm assault injury, that these increases were experienced primarily in historically Black communities, right? Where do we see in terms of the mental health increases, right? For white residents, we see white residents increases, even though small, are larger in areas of concentrated disadvantage. So more disadvantaged white groups experienced the police murder more heavily in terms of mental health diagnoses. In terms of Black residents, we see something that's pretty astonishing to us researchers. If you look at any types of like health outcomes by space, you see more advantaged groups sheltered from that increase, right? And that's pretty stock for, you can see that with COVID data, you can see that with, data from the plague in historically, right? That more advantaged groups were less impacted by pandemic related things or disease, right? And what we see here is that for Black residents, that this effect was global, right? Black residents in more advantaged spaces or more disadvantaged spaces really experienced the police murder kind of equally, right? At least in terms of mental health diagnoses, right? Mental health diagnoses went up as a kind of a constant for Black residents across space. And this is really fascinating from a research perspective and also pretty depressing finding, if you ask me. So some of kind of our conclusions from the work already done, thinking about the police murder of Mr. Floyd and its health impacts in Minneapolis, we find an increased firearm assault injury incidence, and this incidence is not explained, this increase is not explained by COVID policy or by depolicing. If there's something else going on, right, and we think that augmentations of legal estrangement, although we don't have direct measures of that, are probably the most likely explanation. We also find increased mental health diagnoses in Minneapolis, and this increase was concentrated amongst Black residents. That the increase was also global for Black residents, right? And this is pretty astonishing given previous patterns in health-related phenomenon and how advantage can shelter individuals from those effects. All right, so that's the work already been completed. I'll talk briefly about some ongoing work we have going. I'm going to skip over some of the literature review. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if folks want. But what we really do is thinking about police violence more broadly. So thinking just beyond the police murder of George Floyd, how can we get a grasp on what police shootings are doing in Minneapolis more broadly in terms of health effects? And one of the ways that we want to look at this is tying police violence perhaps, or looking at the relationships to historical racism, right? And the two we look at are redlining, which are the homeowners loan corporation grades historically have graded areas of different cities nationally from A to D, A being kind of like the best credit risk scores, which D they called hazardous risk scores. And historically, places that had a higher minority population were graded more harshly, thereby conflating kind of race and financial risk, and locked a lot of individuals out of kind of the kind of capital investment building of homeownership, one of the key ways to build wealth in our country. Right? And also racial covenants. And these were kind of clauses in renting or home ownership deeds where they with explicitly preventing non-white individuals from buying or renting that space. And so I'll show you what those look like across Minneapolis and St. Paul, but we really want to look at what these look like historically and their relationship to contemporary police violence. We also want to look then also at health, right? And to ask what extent that kind of historical racism, right, has been HOLC grades, racial covenants have been tied to health outcomes. To what extent does police shootings kind of mediate that, right? In other words, to what extent did structural racism lead to higher contemporary police violence, which explains some health differences between racial groups in Minneapolis. So this is kind of our theoretical model here, thinking about racial covenants from 1931 to 1955 and its impact on contemporary health outcomes, for sure, but also the extent that it goes through police shootings, right? And police shootings could be one of the ways in which historical racism is carried through to the present. And we do the same thing with, or theorize the same pattern with redlining grades. So some of our key exposures for the quantitative aim of our project are the presence of redlining in a ZCTA, as well as the presence of racial covenants in a zip code. And we look at both health diagnoses and the rate of police shootings as outcomes of that. And we also have some demographic controls in our proposed quantitative design. So I made these maps last night. I think they're kind of pretty and also pretty depressing in a lot of ways. So these are the redlining grades in Minneapolis, St. Paul from 1935. And as we can see that we can see like areas of concentrated disadvantage in Minneapolis, for example, North Minneapolis, also Phillips and East Phillips area in Minneapolis, tended to have those lower graded areas. So we can see a relationship, at least, between contemporary disadvantage and historical processes of racial exclusion, right? And so we want to look at what is the relationship between a space having a lower grade, perhaps, and its health outcomes in the future, as well as its level of police violence in terms of police shootings or uses of force in contemporary times. I also mapped out the racial covenants in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I should note that a lot of this work in Hennepin has completed, but the work in Ramsey County is ongoing. So the St. Paul side here is still ongoing, that data collection in terms of where racial covenants were. You can see I colored each plot of land where the racial covenant resided by the deed year. And so as we can see that there was a large amount of kind of racial covenants in the south part of Minneapolis near Richfield, as well in kind of the Minnehaha Falls area as well, which tend to be historically more advantaged areas. There's also a relationship there between advantage and putting some of these clauses perhaps into deeds. So I'm happy to talk more about kind of our modeling strategies here moving forward with this data. But really what we're interested in is this last one, the kind of mediating relationship here, right? To what extent does historical structural racism pattern contemporary health realities for both white, Black, and other racial identifications in Minneapolis and St. Paul? And to what extent does police violence help carry those effects forward, right? To what extent did historical racial exclusion, right, pattern communities in ways that have led to increased police presence and violence? And to what extent does that police violence patterned before, right, carry forward those racialized patterns in terms of health inequalities? I'm now going to turn it over to another part of our research team, Chris Robertson, who is kind of the lead on our qualitative and interview aspects of our project.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. So as Ryan was saying, I'm going to discuss with you all now the proposed qualitative work that we have. And so what we have here, our qualitative project is exploratory in nature, in that we are mostly looking at how individuals and communities experience and cope with exposure to police violence, and how do they perceive this exposure as impacting their perceptions of their health and their community's health. And so what we have here is a framework that has been posited by DeValder and colleagues that tries to get at or theorizes how police violence exposure impacts mental health. And so they break exposure. They identified three kind of factors, three kind of buckets that make police violence unique and shape how different communities experience police violence differently. And so the first, going from left to right, the first bucket on the left is are factors influencing the prevalence of police violence. And so what this is saying here is that these factors, the proliferation of firearms, America's legacy of racism, and a police culture that defers internal accountability, all link up to influence variations in how in who is exposed to police violence and just its presence on a societal level. And that, and then next in the center circle, they say another factor that makes police violence unique from other forms of violence is its state-sanctioned nature, as well as the perception that police violence is deployed along racial and class lines, that folks can be arrested, after being victimized by police violence, and or the risk of incarceration is always on the table. And so so there's a threat that the threat of force, the threat of incarceration that underlies police encounters, and that police have access to weapons, to guns. And then the final bucket is the final way that police violence impacts mental health, as proposed by DeValder and colleagues, is the fact that police, there are factors associated with or impacts coping and recovery, meaning that because police are pervasive in communities, as well as in the media depictions, that in a sense policing is everywhere, as well as the lack of accountability for harm and the stigma, i.e. The stigma associated with people who are victimized by the police, i.e. that person deserved it, that person had a gun, etc., all link up to where folks who are exposed to policing, either directly or indirectly, they have limited, or their coping abilities are limited, because they in a sense see the person or see the group that victimized them in their communities, and vaulted in media, and or their reporting of victimization isn't believed. And so these three factors, the prevalence, the disparities in police violence exposure, policing state-sanctioned nature, and its limitation of coping, all impact mental health. And so our qualitative project is trying to disentangle those three buckets, mainly by using the framework of resilience to understand, which refers to the ability through positive emotions, successful traits, or coping behaviors. So thinking, for example, grit, or as being a successful trait, or coping behaviors as in, folks speaking to others, or processing their harm with others, seeking therapy, etc. We use the concept of resilience to understand how people respond to their exposure to police violence, or to the traumas that are incurred from being exposed to police violence. Now, resilience has become a very popular and common framework that's been used by researchers over the past few decades. And scholars increasingly are criticizing this framework for placing the emphasis on individuals to adapt to the harms, rather than focusing on how systems can adapt so they can stop causing harm. And so, as I'll say on the next slide, our project aims to look at both the how individuals make sense of their harm and how they've adapted, but also how systems, as Ryan discussed with looking at redlining and racial covenants and police shootings, how they foster harm among residents of these communities. And so our work contributes to existing knowledge of police violence-related coping strategies, which have thus far been identified as the talk that Black parents have with their children about the harms of policing and being safe, and as well as hypervigilance, where folks get hyper aroused or get kind of put their head on the swivel when around police officers, and then police avoidance, i.e. avoiding places where police are patrolling, staying inside, etc. But our work is trying to expand and contribute to this knowledge by saying that, hey, police violence, as discussed with the previous framework, is a very unique form of violence, which means there are likely more strategies that folks engage in to help respond to the trauma and harm of policing. And we are trying to uncover that through this qualitative study. And so we're doing this by using a framework for holistic framework for holistic traumatic healing that's been posited by Alvarez and Fende Wu. And this framework here has three focuses, three buckets. The first being it draws on multiple forms of knowledge and experience. These authors use this framework to look at colonial abuses and their impacts on traumatized youth in a school setting. We're drawing insights from this framework to, of course, look at state-sponsored violence, police violence against communities that have experienced high levels of police shootings. And so, firstly, this framework calls on drawing on multiple forms of knowledge and experience. As Kamisha will lead us, we are, with this work, we have to center other ways of thinking about trauma, of responding to trauma, both in sense of the mind and the body. And so this project tries to center those other forms, non-Western forms of thinking, so as to create or expand our range of responding and understanding the harm. And then also, secondly, approaches to trauma at multiple time points. So this is thinking about trauma at 3 points. Proactively, so I'm trying to reduce the traumatic exposure; interactively, which means responding in real time to the trauma; and then reactively, in terms of trying to build long-term supports to address the impacts of trauma. And so this area is aspirational in trying to understand how we can reduce and meet people in the midst of the trauma, and also provide support so that trauma isn't so that we're ending the trauma. And then finally, this framework challenges or calls on us to use organic approaches to build relationships and supports. Again, here highlighting Kamisha's work in thinking about how we can build relationships of care and support, so as to bring about substantial healing and again, reduce the effects of trauma. And so that leads us to our qualitative research questions, which are: how do police shootings shape residents' perceptions of their individual and community health, as well as how do strategies of resilience used by community members shape these processes? So again, trying to understand how individuals make sense of policing's impact on their health, as well as how they manage and navigate navigate that relationship. And so we plan to answer these questions by conducting 40 semi-structured interviews with adult residents of Minneapolis, St. Paul, ZCTAs, I'll use zip codes for short and for clarity, that have experienced a recent, so since 2015 police shooting. These interviews will last about 60 to 90 minutes. The focus will be on understanding the residents' their perceptions of their health, their perceptions of their community's health, as well as the community bonds, thinking about how their current stress, perceived stress loads, and their thoughts on policing in general, and what they do whenever they are become aware of a police shooting in their communities or in their social world. So among people they know and people who share identities that they have. And the goals here are to identify potential mechanisms, including, as I said, their stress perceptions and coping behaviors and resiliency that may link up to police shootings, and may link up to their health via police shootings. And these will be in-person recorded. And so along with that, in hopes of drawing on other ways of knowing and being as that collective healing framework emphasized, we want to build out the interview guide, i.e. Make sense of the questions that we have by conducting 3 focus groups with 18 residents of these impacted zip codes. We'll prioritize residents from historically redlined areas to ensure that we have their perspective and kind of understand potentially how redlining may impact today from their perspective. And that, again, the goal here is to pilot some of our interview questions, see if there's additional areas that we should be thinking about or additional methods we should be considering, as well as discuss potential policy solutions. And we aim to, or we plan to recruit folks for the focus group and for our interviews by working with local health organizations, social organizations, and seeing and trying to invite their adult client population who's eligible to participate. We also will mail study invitations to folks living in these zip codes to extend the opportunities to join the focus groups or participate in the interviews. And so here are some sample questions. Again, thinking about how folks are making sense of policing's impact on their health, and how they come to know and hear about police shooting an unarmed person, and kind of what they do afterwards. Thinking about, just given the routineness of police shootings, what do folks do whenever what do folks feel after they become aware of it, and what do they do to navigate those multitude of feelings they have after being exposed to police violence. And so what we'll do, so after we've completed the focus group, the focus groups, as well as completed the interview, we'll use the focus group insights to build out and to refine those questions. Then we'll interview those 40 people. And then from there, we'll transcribe the interviews, get a transcript, and we'll engage in a flexible coding approach, which means that we will go through and we will code each interview looking for some descriptive codes, i.e. Our descriptive codes where folks are just saying, hey, or describing a kind of base level kind of their experiences, and then conceptual codes where we're thinking in terms of concepts, as in someone sharing that they felt legally, or someone just sharing a response that could be classified as legal estrangement. And then from there, we'll do this across all of the transcripts. We'll write memos that kind of identify kind of patterns that we're seeing across common themes, and then We'll also compare folks across demographics to see if folks are having shared experiences. Then we'll kind of go back and recode and just recode with the after looking at literature and looking at all of the interview transcripts and the memos. And then from there, once we get to a point of saturation when we're seeing multiple or seeing the same patterns over and over, then we'll discuss as a team and draft up our findings. And so here are the deliverables: a research manuscript, grant proposal, policy report. Here thinking, I admittedly, we're researchers. And so when it comes to thinking about solutions and deliverables, this is typically what we think. And I welcome any suggestions folks may have about how we can push this work forward to be applied and contribute something that will more directly address this problem of police violence exposure. But highlight the grant proposal, or I highlight these deliverables as in they may help to increase funding for healing work in the community, as well as a greater awareness of the linkage between structural racism, policing, and health outcomes. And so with that, I'll pass it on to Kamisha.
Peace again, everyone. Before we get started, we have been doing the heavy lifting, been hearing some numbers and a lot of data. And some of us are going right back to May 25th, 2020, when Brother George Floyd was lynched, and how it basically changed the atmosphere of our communities and beyond, right? So I just want to offer us something that I offer in the spaces that I curate, and we are just going to take a minute to get back grounded in our bodies. And so at this time, get comfortable in your seat. If you would like to close your eyes, I invite you to close your eyes. I invite you to find a focal point or a soft glaze somewhere and just get present in your breath. From the center, at the center of me, please let me feel inner peace. I invite you to take the deepest breath you've taken all day. So deep inhale in through your nose and hold and exhale through your mouth. Again, go right back into your breath, deepest breath you've taken all day. And exhale through the mouth. Again, deep inhale in through the nose, filling that belly full of air, prana, oxygen, whatever it is you call air. Hold it. And release. If you can be so kind, we're going to body scan. I want you to check, are you clenching your jaw? If you are clenching your jaw, I want you to remove your tongue from the roof of your mouth. Relax your jaw. If you are frowning, I invite you to soften your eyebrows. Relax your face. If your shoulders are up at your ears, relax your shoulders. Be present in your body. You are safe. You are okay. If you have your hands tight in a fist, I invite you to relax your hands. If you are bouncing your legs, I invite you to calm your legs. If you have your toes curled in a ball, I invite you to relax your feet, wiggle your toes. You are calm. Get grounded in your body. We have this one avatar, this one vessel, which is our bodies. The functions of our cells, our DNA, our organs, they all function on their own. Let's give gratitude to our bodies. Two more collective deep breaths together. Deep inhale in through the nose. Let's breathe in love. Exhale hate. Deep inhale in healing. Exhale trauma. And when you are ready, come back into space. Light stretch your neck side to side. Make sure you're back into your body. Sometimes we float off into the galaxies, and that's what we need to do, but I invite you to get back into your body. So peace, I hope that was relaxing and calming for only a moment. You can always come back to that. That is your practice. However you want to incorporate that into your self-care rituals or arsenal, it is imperative that we always get back to our breath. Doing some of the work that we do as community leaders and just members, educators, youth workers, we are exposed to a lot of trauma. And what we know is George Floyd really heightened a lot of it for us. We became extremely hypervigilant. Some of us started to have physiological changes in our bodies that we never experienced before. One thing I want to share about where my work really heightened and it kind of catapulted into this healing justice and racial justice work. I had a therapy practice in Savage, Minnesota. Yes. I was seeing and providing healing, well, talk therapy for a lot of white bodies out there. I will be honest about that. I was out there for about 6.5 years when Brother George Floyd, when everything happened. I unfortunately never watched the video, but just I felt it. I'm an active empath. I felt it in my body. I closed my practice. And I came full force into marginalized communities. I was always doing work in community. That's just a part of who I am. But I no longer wanted to just do talk therapy. I didn't want to just sit on a couch. I knew I needed to actively be on the front line and assisting people in their healing. And so what I did, I was at 38th in Chicago, providing space for people in prayer, meditation. We did a lot of smoke purification with sage and Palo Santos. A lot of elders and other community healers and leaders came together and we just showed up for community. I even took it a step further. I use my social media platforms for people to have a safe space, a non-judgmental space, to just come and dump, ask questions, war cry, discuss what was going on in our community because we were literally up in smoke. And so by me doing that, I got a lot of recognition. I got a recognition from the Star Tribune, which you guys will see here in a moment, where I provided my platforms to the community where they can come and get healing our way, however that looked. If we needed to do narrative medicine and you just share your story with like-minded people and people that have had the same lived experiences or similar, we would drum. We did a drumming circle. We did singing bowls. We just needed to show up and share space. We did yoga. We did guided meditation. We did a lot of breath work. So we did things that were just outside of just a talk therapy practice and outside of medications. We wanted to do something that was specifically for us and was wrapped in how we traditionally would heal ourselves. And in that, as you guys see on the screen, Sacred Dialogue, this is for one of the organizations that I have contracts with, but they would hire me to come in and either work with youth workers, or educators to curate space for them to discuss some of what they were seeing in our communities, whether it was what was going on, some of the residual effects of what happened with Brother George Floyd, the increase in community violence, more things that were happening with police brutality. I even just curated a healing circle this past Wednesday, which was the death anniversary of Jamar Clark, who was killed by MPD. We came together this past Wednesday, families that have been affected by police brutality, and Ricky Cobb's family was there. That brother was just murdered in July. So we are continuing to hold space, and it is much needed. And the families say it over and over again. They come once a month, and I just hold space for them because they are really hurting from what they experience. But I kind of digress. Back to this community event is usually closed to the organization, and so what I do is just what you guys witness me do. I provide breath work, I do a guided meditation, and then we go into sacred dialogue because I believe in narrative medicine and allowing people to get it out of their bodies. Um, Somatic therapy is real. A lot of things that's going on in our mind will then manifest into our bodies, and then we'll have ailments and illnesses that, as we can see in the numbers that Ryan and Christopher have presented to us, our mental health is being affected at alarming rates. So it was prior to what happened to George Floyd, and now it's even being exacerbated at this time. So at this time, Ryan, if you can be so kind, we can go into the Star Tribune video. Thank you. Ryan, it appears we're having some issues with sound. And due to respect for time, maybe we could just leave the link somewhere or present it at the end of our presentation, and they can look at it when they want to, because we're down to like 4 minutes, and I'm pretty sure we want to get to some of the questions that are in the chat. I'm okay with whatever you guys decide. Oh, okay. Paulina said, Ryan, I can't hear you now. I don't know if is that just me?
Can't
Chris,
hear
you can
my.
hear me?
No, I can't.
Oh, you can't hear him either? Okay.
No.
So, Christopher, should we go into the chat? Oh, there was something that I would like to address. Someone asked about the typo of of the death of George Floyd, and that was a typo, pardon us, May 25th of 2020, not 2005. So thank you for allowing us to make that clarification.
Yes, and it looks as though in response to the question about erasure of Asian American and American Indian indigenous populations, Ryan just responded to that question in the chat, and so and Ryan, it looks as though Ryan's responded to all the questions thus far. Thank you for. Or if anyone has any additional questions in our last remaining minutes, please feel free to post them. If not, we can also share our email addresses in the chat in case anybody wants to reach out to us afterwards to discuss what we talked about, or kind of share your thoughts or ask additional questions. We welcome it. We welcome you all interacting with us, and you all supporting us by being here.